everyone, and welcome to the Heritage Foundation. I'm Andrew Parks, the Assistant Director of Lectures and Seminars. Thank you for joining us today in the Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. I just want to take the opportunity to remind everyone to please silence your cell phones and encourage those watching online to submit questions by emailing speaker@heritage.org. For future reference, this program is being recorded and broadcast, and it will be available on the heritage.org website within 24 hours. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's program, Thomas Spohr. He is the Director of the Center for National Defense here at the Heritage Foundation.
Thanks, Andrew, and good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us so much. And before I get started, I want to recognize the presence of Ambassador Bill Middendorf, former Secretary of the Navy during the Ford administration, instrumental in getting the funding and the support for the Trident missile system, the Aegis system, and all kinds of other things. So let's just give him a little round of applause here. Thank you. Thank you, sir, for joining us. Well, I'm really excited about this. As a former Army officer, there is not much I could tell you about submarines, but luckily we have assembled a great panel of folks to talk to us today. And so, as part of the consideration for the 2020 fiscal year President's budget, they're going to be looking at nuclear modernization. And like everything, they're going to look at it pretty hard. And I think you probably all saw where the Congressional Budget Office probably 6 months or so estimated the cost of the nuclear modernization at $1.2 trillion. Now that's over a period 2017, I think, to 2046, but nevertheless a significant amount of money. And the biggest component of that cost is the Columbia-class ballistic missile submarine at $313 billion. Again, long period of time, but nevertheless a lot of money. Because of that large number, big things tend to draw attention. It's inevitable that this submarine, even though it enjoys widespread support across the administration and DoD, is going to get a lot of attention. Today's panel will examine the case for the Columbia-class submarine and DoD's expressed requirement for 12 such subs. As I mentioned, we've assembled a great panel. It's kind of a wonderful mix of the uniformed military, the think tank world, academia, and think tanks. First to my left, Rear Admiral John Taemin, Director of the Undersea Warfare Division, Office of the Chief of Naval Operations. Admiral Taemin graduated from Rensselaer Polytechnic with a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering and earned a Master of Engineering Management from Old Dominion University. The Admiral has had numerous assignments in the Navy's submarine force, including Commanding Officer of the USS Georgia and Commodore of Submarine Squadron 19, as well as significant assignments in submarine training, budgeting, as well as in operational energy. As a flag officer, he served as the Deputy Director, Plans and Policy at U.S. Strategic Command and Commander Submarine Group 9, Naval Base Kitsap in Washington. Next to him, Mr. Brian Clark, a Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. He received his Bachelor of Science in Chemistry and Philosophy from the University of Idaho and his Master of Science in National Security Studies from the National War College. Prior to joining CSBA in 2013, Brian Clark was a Special Assistant to the Chief of Naval Operations and the Director of his Commander's Action Group, where he led development of Navy strategy and implemented new initiatives in electromagnetic spectrum operations, undersea warfare, expeditionary operations, and personnel and readiness management. Mr. Clark served in the Navy headquarters from 2004 to 2011, leading studies in the Assessment Division, participating in the 2006 and 10 Quadrennial Defense Reviews. Mr. Clark has served as an enlisted and an officer submariner, serving afloat and ashore submarine operational and training assignments, including tours as a chief engineer and operations officer at the Navy's Nuclear Power Training Unit. Next to Mr. Clark is Dr. James Acton. He holds the Jessica T. Matthews Chair and is co-director of the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He received his PhD in theoretical physics from Cambridge University. His research focuses on the escalation risks of advanced conventional weapons. His work on this subject includes the Carnegie-edited volume Entanglement, Chinese and Russian Perspectives on Non-Nuclear Weapons and Nuclear Risks, and a forthcoming article in the journal International Security. His publications span the field of nuclear policy. His analysis on proliferation risk, including from Iran and North Korea, has been widely disseminated by major journals, newspapers, and websites. And then our final panelist is the Heritage Foundation's Tom Callender. Tom is a senior fellow for defense programs in the Heritage Foundation's Center for National Defense. His focus areas are naval warfare and advanced defense technologies. He's a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, where he earned a Bachelor's of Science in Physics and received a Master of Science degree in Applied Physics from Johns Hopkins. A retired submariner, Tom's active duty assignments included several attack submarines as well as shore assignments in the Office of Naval Intelligence, the Office of the Vice Chief of Naval Operations, and the staff of the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Plans and Strategy. Prior to joining Heritage, Tom served as the Director for Capabilities in the Capabilities and Concepts Directorate of the Office of the Deputy Undersecretary of the Navy for Policy, where he was responsible for assessing naval programs, technology development, and warfighting concepts. So really a great group. I'm excited about this. Each of our panelists is going to talk for about 10 minutes or so, and then following that, we're going to go to you for your thoughts and your questions. And so, Admiral, sir, if I could ask you to begin, please.
Absolutely. Tom, thank you and the Heritage Foundation very much for inviting me to come here and talk about a topic which you'll find I'm very passionate about. Being Director of Undersea Warfare, obviously Columbia is one of my programs, and we're very excited about it. Again, the topic is modernizing the sea-based leg of the Triad, but more importantly, I think, the caveat you have in the title is, why 12 Columbia submarines? And I know you, Tom, you talked about the cost of, the Columbia program writ large over the life cycle of Columbia. But I will tell you, it's a generational investment, and it's something that's absolutely needed for national security. From a historical perspective, it's helpful to kind of look at where we've been as a nation. All right, we started off, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s with the 41 for Freedom, where we developed the Polaris missile, transitioned to the Poseidon missile, and then onto the Trident C4. In the 80s and in the early 2000s, we built 18 Ohio-class SSBNs to replace the 41 for Freedom, and we transitioned from the C4 missile to the D5 missile. Again, another generation, post-Cold War, around roughly 2006 or so, we took that peace dividend and we converted the first 4 Ohio-class SSBNs into guided missile submarines, which are providing our nation tremendous conventional deterrence at this time. And now, we're at another kind of crossroads where we require another generational investment in national security. We're going to recapitalize the sea-based leg of the strategic deterrent with 12 Columbia-class submarines. And I will say 12, but if you looked at the most recent nuclear posture review, the number is really at least 12 Columbia-class submarines, with the proviso that we can, look at the strategic environment as we finish up on Columbia production, when the 12th submarine is built. And again, I would point out that, like it or not, we are entering a period of great power competition, and the 2 great powers obviously are Russia and China. And I can say that the need for deterrence has never been greater, and that's based on the destructive of modern-day weapons and the competitive landscape that we're seeing with the resurgent Russia and China, attempting to make their place in the global domain. The other point I would make is that we have to own those top rungs of the escalation ladder, particularly when certain adversaries have a stated strategy of escalate to de-escalate, primarily using nuclear weapons. Our competitors must understand that we cannot be out-escalated, hence, our part of the triad, and that we must have the will and the credible capability to respond as necessary to their aggression, and that the cost of any action they would take will be greatly outweighed by any perceived gains that they have intended. And then, the other part of Columbia-class and the Triad writ large is the extended deterrence that we provide to our allies, so that we can give them that assurance and ensure that they don't need to proliferate additional nuclear weapons as would be necessary. So then the next question becomes, so why Columbia? As confirmed by the Nuclear Posture Review, all 3 legs of the Triad are important. And I would say, listening to Admiral Haney over the years while I was at STRATCOM, there's actually a 4th leg of the Triad it doesn't really get talked about a lot, and that's the NC3 portion, right? Because without the enabling of NC3, it's really tough to enable the triad to do its mission. And again, all three legs are important because we want to give the president options. We don't want him to ever feel like he has no maneuver space. And I will say Columbia gives us the sea-based leg. Being the most survivable, what it gives the president is time to make a decision. He doesn't have to worry that he's going to have an attack that will decimate his ability to respond. So that survivable leg always allows the president the option to wait out the fog of war, calculate a response, and then have that assured leg of the triad ready at his need. I know James has written many articles on entanglement, and my point would be that Columbia program helps buy down that risk, since the president is not ever put in a use or lose scenario in the fog of war. I would also say, what Columbia gives us is the ability to leverage, 50 years of experience in terms of a strategic deterrence using a at-sea deterrent. And currently, the at-sea leg provides for 70% of the accountable warheads. And those are on Ohio-class today, and we'll use those same D5 life-extended missiles on Columbia as we move forward. So with that in mind, the next question is, so why do we need 12 Columbias? And, U.S. Strategic Command has a stated requirement for always having 10 operational ballistic missile submarines. And we're able to do that with 12. Right now we have 14 Ohio-class. And we're able to do that because, we've built in life-of-the-ship cores, or will be building in life-of-the-ship cores for Columbia-class. So we remove the extended maintenance period to refuel them. But also contributing to that 10 is the need to operate in 2 oceans, and the way we get to survivable is by ensuring that those ballistic missile submarines have just very large areas of the ocean to operate in, so they remain undetected and they remain survivable. And then also built into the analysis for 12 submarines is the maintenance life cycle for the Columbia-class and the various things we need to do to make sure that the weapon system maintains its reliability. And then I would offer, what do you get by buying a Columbia-class submarine? So obviously the most obvious is you get an ultra-quiet platform, which lends to its being survivable. You get a submarine that's designed from the get-go to be a 42-year submarine. As you know, for Ohio-class, it was originally a 30-some-odd-year submarine that we have extended out to 42 years. But with the life-of-the-ship core, we should get 42 years out of Columbia from the get-go, which is important considering the cost of that submarine. So you want to design it for as long as possible. We're also leveraging, as I said earlier, the 50 years of experience with ballistic missile submarines and the success, therefore. And then I would also say what we're doing is we're leveraging everything we've learned in building Virginia-class and baking that into Columbia. So the successes of Virginia will be rolled into Columbia as well. And then, along those lines, from the weapon system standpoint, we've had 171 successful launches with our Trident missile system, which is just, lends to that credible part of a deterrent. And, we are conducting at least 4 tests per year, and that helps deter any potential adversary. And then I'll finish with probably the most important part of Columbia. What you get is you get the people. So what you get is, a group of individuals steeped in submarine culture of excellence, and as the CNO say, a group of individuals that are cultured in what we call high velocity learning, so that we seek excellence and they're out there every day maintaining the security of our nation. So with that, I'll pass it over to Brian.
Thank you so much, Admiral. Brian Clark, over to you, sir.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you for inviting me today. It's great to be here at Heritage again, and it's great to be here with some old shipmates as well. And hopefully my time working for John did not result in any PTSD or anything
later.
like that. So as one of the think tankers here, I wanted to address some of the questions that come up when we talk about the sea-based strategic deterrent, and that surrounds its cost, its utility, how many do we need, and some of the potential vulnerabilities that it has, which some would use to argue that maybe you don't want to have a sea-based deterrent. And I think that maybe the argument really should be turned on its head, and some of the vulnerabilities might be things that really drive you to have a more capable sea-based strategic deterrent. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So kind of the main points I wanted to make here on the slides. I brought slides. So the first thing to keep in mind is the undersea leg of the deterrent is the most survivable. It'll continue to be the most survivable. But arguably each leg of the deterrent, I think James will probably talk about this a little bit, has a different role. So just like John was saying, the sea-based, the undersea deterrent has that job of being the sort of last resort capability for the president. So the commander-in-chief always has that ability to launch a retaliatory attack if necessary, even after other options have been exhausted or lost due to escalation management problems. The ground-based leg of the deterrent is used to drive the adversary to have to think about attacking the United States homeland to be able to eliminate it. So even though it's probably well known and targeted, it still would have to be a homeland attack that would take it out. And the air-based leg of the triad is usually designed to provide you some ability to do messaging and to have some delayed action so that you could begin to move a capability into place to start sending the message to the adversary that you mean business. So each leg has its own role. The sea-based leg's role relies on its being the most survivable. The challenge, though, with the way it's designed, though, is because you've got a bunch of eggs in a basket, a bunch of missiles in a single submarine. If you take out that submarine, either through just suppression of its operations or by sinking it, you've eliminated all those weapons all at once. And so that makes it very important that we not just have one submarine out there being our sea-based deterrent, but have a number of submarines so that you've got some ability to reconstitute immediately that capability, and you force the adversary to find multiple submarines to really be able to eliminate that leg of the triad. So the brittleness of the sea-based leg is something that has to be mitigated through force structure and by having multiple submarines on alert patrol, or at least on patrol so they could step in when the alert submarine is lost for some reason. The challenge that we face right now, as John alluded to, is that they're relatively expensive. So these submarines are going to be in the $6 billion range each, and there's a lot of pressure to try to reduce those costs because of the cost of recapitalizing the nuclear complex overall. You see over right now a lot of discussion on the Hill with the new Democratic majority that they want to look at nuclear modernization as an area to try to achieve savings that could be applied to other purposes within the military or to other purposes in general. The problem with doing that, though, is each leg of the triad has its role. The sea-based leg in particular relies on having enough force structure that you've got this redundancy so that its brittleness does not result in it being a potentially unstable part of the escalation dynamic, which I think James will probably address, is if you have a asset that's taken out and results in a very large change in your nuclear capacity, you could end up with a dynamic where that incentivizes the adversary to go after that. So you want to have enough submarines so that you can spread that risk out and reduce the benefits to an adversary of trying to go after your SSBNs. So that means that that would argue against using the submarine or the SSBN as a cost savings mechanism by cutting the numbers from 12 down to some lower number. But I think you're going to see a lot of discussion on the Hill this session about why do we need 12? What's the benefits of having a larger number versus a smaller number of SSBNs? And so the focus going forward should be on how do we ensure that you've got that redundancy in your deployed SSBN capacity, and how do we ensure that that deployed SSBN capacity is not too vulnerable to an adversary's anti-submarine warfare efforts. And so I'd make a little cartoon here, but there's a lot of changes happening in the world of anti-submarine warfare. Countries like China and Russia have been investing a long time in a variety of new anti-submarine warfare technologies. The Russians, for decades, have invested in non-acoustic ASW that they believe might, offer some eventual capability to find submarines over large areas or with long, dwell times. So they can try to search very large portions of the ocean with non-acoustic ASW. There's increasing use of active anti-submarine warfare, particularly low-frequency sonar that's achieving longer ranges, covering larger areas. So you could see a world in which if we don't have sufficient number of SSBNs out there, an adversary could be incentivized to go after them to try to take out that one submarine and take all those eggs out at once. the way that we would have to deal with that is either by investing in a sufficient number of SSBNs so that you've got some backup submarines on patrol, and then also some mechanisms to try to protect the submarine itself. And so we haven't had to think about pro-SSBN operations in a long time, meaning using attack submarines or other naval forces to go protect or to guard our SSBNs to ensure that they're not vulnerable to an adversary holding them at risk, which would sort of undermine our escalation dominance. So some of the capabilities I put up on the cartoon are things that we might need to use in the future. So we might need to have SSNs going on patrol in support of SSBNs, which is what the Soviets did back in the Cold War. We might have to have active acoustic decoys that go out and try to simulate an SSBN to take the adversary, off the course of the real submarine. We might have to have jamming in the acoustic environment of the undersea to try to hide a submarine that's on patrol. And then we'll probably have to put out sensor arrays to try to protect our submarine patrol areas to ensure that our SSBNs are not being surveilled, by adversary submarines that are coming to watch them. The challenge then is going to be, do we have a sufficient force structure to support those kind of pro-SSBN operations? And if you look on the chart there that shows the U.S. submarine fleet, both the attack submarine fleet on the top and the ballistic missile submarine fleet on the bottom. The attack submarine fleet is going into a dip that will put it below its required force structure for several years, a couple of decades, until it regains the number that it's supposed to have, which is 66. During that time, it's going to be very difficult for us to manage to deploy a lot of attack submarines in pro-SSBN operations because they'll have other things to do overseas. We'll have to think about using a lot more unmanned systems, both stationary and relocatable unmanned systems or unmanned vehicles to try to do these pro-SSBN operations. To ensure that we can maintain the sea-based deterrent as that most survivable leg and mitigate the vulnerability that might come from its brittleness as an element of the strategic triad. So those are the things I have to say. Over to you.
Brian, thank you so much. James?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been in Washington for 10 years, and I think this is probably the most intimidating panel I've taken part on. I'm surrounded by 3 submariners. I have never set foot on a submarine. I can, however, recite word for word Sean Connery's speech from the bridge in Hunt for Red October. I won't try and compete in terms of detailed understanding of individual submarines. I think where I can contribute to this panel is in terms of how submarines fit into the larger issue of the US nuclear posture as a whole. And as our chair has already pointed out, CBO, Congressional Budget Office, has said that the cost of nuclear modernization, it's not just modernization, the cost of everything nuclear over the next 30 years is going to be about $1.2 trillion. It's important to realize that that isn't spread uniformly over the next 30 years. There's and this shows you the influence of the Navy on nuclear strategy, there's what's known as the bow wave in expenditure, where today the cost for nuclear forces is about 30 billion, and that's going to rise to 50 billion by the 2030s. Now, look, I'm not naive about this. I'm aware that as the White House Chief of Staff has said, when it comes to budget deficits, no one cares. But let me assure you, when President Harris takes office in 2021, people are going to really start worrying about the budget deficit again. And I think there are going to be real trade-offs that are going to have to be made here. And so what I really want to address is if you want 12 submarines, and I think I probably do, by the way, how do you make space for that? Where are the trade-offs going to be? For me, the single most important attribute in nuclear forces is survivability. And people often ask the question about, will SSBNs be survivable in 10, 20, 30, 40 years? I think that's fundamentally the wrong question to be asking. I think the right question to be asking is, which leg of the triad is most likely to be survivable in however many years in the face of technological change? Because it's not just the SSBN force that faces survivability challenges. It's the other legs of the triad as well. And from that perspective, I think SSBNs probably are the leg of the triad that is least likely to be undermined by technological change. ICBMs are unquestionably already vulnerable to a large-scale nuclear strike. I think they're also increasingly vulnerable to long-ranged, advanced non-nuclear weapons. I'm actually relatively optimistic when it comes to aircraft survivability. I think the combination of stealth with accompanying offensive operations makes me actually relatively optimistic, as I've said. But at the end of the day, attacking aircraft, I think, is for all the reasons that Brian has indicated, is an easier problem than locating and attacking SSBNs. And more than that, and Brian alluded to this, but I want to bring this out, new technology can help protect SSBNs as well as hunt SSBNs. The use of acoustic decoys that Brian's already mentioned, I think, is a very good example of that. So, for all of those reasons, I think the SSBN investment is one that's worthwhile making. However, and there are kind of two howevers here. Again, I'm kind of copying Brian here, but the consequences of a single submarine becoming vulnerable are much bigger than the consequences of a single aircraft or a single ICBM becoming vulnerable. Depending on exactly how you define this thing, roughly 5 to 10% of the total arsenal of survivable strategic warheads is deployed in each submarine. It depends a bit on how you define survivable strategic warheads, how many warheads you think are at sea, how many aircraft warheads are available. But one is thinking about 5 to 10% of the entire force is represented by a single submarine. And command and control for submarines has particular challenges associated with it. Partly because of the potentially very long distances from the homeland at which submarines are operating, and partly, without wanting to get too technical here, high-frequency waves just don't penetrate very deeply into water, and that's a problem. What all this leads me to is two immediate conclusions about the SSBN force. The first one, and this is where a lot of my focus of my research is at the moment, I think we need to be investing much more as a nation in command and control. I think we've been shortchanging that. I think there is a huge mistake simply by... I worry we will rebuild the same command and control architecture we already have, just do it a bit better. I think that's a mistake. The kind of command and control that I would want us to build is going to be more expensive, and that's going to put more budgetary pressure. I would also just say in passing that I think, given what I've said about submarine survivability, and in particular the risk of losing a single submarine, I think the low-yield D5 is a bad idea. As some of you may be aware, in fact, the first production unit of this warhead rolled off the other day. It's a modified W76 warhead with a lower yield option. This is to address a real problem, which is low-yield Russian use of nuclear weapons early in a conflict. I think it's the wrong solution to that problem. And in particular, I think one of the problems here is because the use of a single warhead off an SSBN risks giving away the location of that SSBN. Now, you can think the probability of that SSBN successfully being hunted down is very low. And you're probably right that it would be very low. But if Russia's used a low-yield nuclear warhead first, we're already in a nuclear war. And I think in that scenario, even a low probability of compromising a submarine would seem to a president at the time to be a risk that's not worth paying when there are other low-yield options already available in the arsenal. So I'm not a big fan of the low-yield D5. I've said that the most important consideration for me in posturing a nuclear force is survivability. That's probably relatively uncontroversial. More controversial, I think, maybe what I consider the second most important characteristic, which is the ability to signal. Since Hiroshima, no president has ordered the use of a nuclear weapon, thankfully. But presidents frequently have engaged in nuclear signaling of one form or another. That's an option that I want to give the president. If we're ever really considering using nuclear weapons, I would rather signal that to an adversary before we use them and create some chance of de-escalating the crisis. Now, you can signal with SSBNs, right? The US could very visibly send an SSBN out to sea. But if we're actually worried a nuclear war is going to happen, that's something we probably don't want to do, right? You probably want to deploy it as quietly as possible. And ICBMs are virtually useless from a signaling perspective. So, from a signaling perspective, to compensate for the fact that you don't really want to use SSBNs for that, then that's where bombers, I think, have their real value. So I've said nice things about the SSBN force. I've said nice things about the bomber force. You probably guessed where I'm going with this. Given the budgetary pressures that I've outlined at the beginning of my remarks, given the bow wave in expenditure that's coming up, if the goal is really to keep a force of 12 SSBNs, and as I say, I'm certainly not against that in principle, it seems to me that the trade-off is most likely to be with the ICBM force. And that from a kind of long-term budgetary perspective, deciding to think about and make those trade-offs now is almost certainly a lot more cost-effective than being forced to make them 10 or 20 years from now. And let me conclude there.
Thank you very much. And now we'll conclude with Tom Callender.
Thank you, Tom. So I'll build upon some of the comments by my other panelists here, and first starting off of of the SSBN force in general, the importance. I would say, since George Washington did that first patrol in late 1960 and early 1961, not only has it been the SSBN force the most survivable, I'd argue it's one of the most probably successful defense programs between the submarines and the combined missile systems that Admiral Taemin talked about in history. We've had in the U.S. history with over, I think we're approaching 5,000 deterrent patrols, getting close to that so far this time. And U.S. SSBNs are still practically virtually undetectable, and continuous at sea can hold those strategic targets at risk, greatly contributing to U.S. strategic deterrence with that. The one thing, as Admiral Taemin talked about, is we've been forced, over several years of budgetary decisions and other impacts on the defense budget to delay the modernization of the U.S. SSBN force. And so with that, right, we've extended the Ohio's from 30 years to 42 years, and they'll be the longest serving nuclear submarines in U.S. history when they reach retirement in that respect. And all the Navy, again, the Trident submarines and the Ohio's with not only the modernization piece, but the maintenance piece. The Navy maintains them at the highest, I'd say, reliability level possible with readiness. But as they get older and as we start approaching that 42 years, the likelihood of potential unforeseen material issues, especially maybe in some of those non-nuclear support systems, obviously is going to increase and prevents, a greater likelihood of maintaining 10 operational SSNs. So the importance of the Columbia getting out there in time, cannot be overstated with this. And with that too, as some people talk about, the cutting, do we need 12? Can we do less? It's important to realize that, we've already delayed the program 2 years. So the first Columbia will get its first deterrent patrol in 2031 when we're already at 10 SSBNs, which is the STRATCOM requirement, 10 operational SSBNs. So if there's any further delay or someone would try to cut some initial submarines from the beginning of that production line, we're not going to be able to maintain that, 10 operational SSBNs, and it then impacts on our strategic nuclear deterrent and that piece with it too. So if you do talk about cuts, you're going to be forced in the out years with it. So really not going to be seeing any savings in any of the near term here, the next 10 to 20 years. The cost of the program, yes, is an expensive program. The acquisition, over $100 billion. But I think it's important to judge this cost against the importance of this mission, as my fellow panelists have already touched on, the importance that they are to the overall national security, strategic deterrence, and ensuring, global peace and other adversaries don't take advantage. As Admiral Taemin talked somewhat about, right, some of the advanced technologies that are being incorporated into Columbia design to help sure it has the most advanced stealth technologies, right? We've got electric drive motor, a lot of other technologies in there to ensure it's the most advanced submarine getting out there now. And also, as I said, the incredible success we've had of the Ohio-class submarine and the Trident missile program. Looking at that success and carrying that forward, I think you need to balance those and what you're getting, over the next, 42 years of each of these submarines. But also touching on somewhat, what Brian and said about, people say, okay, our Columbia is going to be able to remain, undetectable and survivable going forward with some of these new technologies, right? Some new, unmanned systems, non-acoustic systems, and all these things out there. And I will say this: it's not, these stealth technologies are an important part of our SSBN survivability and remaining undetectable, but it's just part of the piece. As Admiral Taemin said, right, the ability of our SSBNs to, essentially between the submarines and the range of the Trident missile affords pretty much, most of the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans could be potential patrol areas. So having that large area that an adversary will have to search, even though you've got some of these new technologies, right? If you have to search millions of square miles, it makes it, infinitely harder to find him instead of if I know he's in a certain area coming out of that. And also, right, the ConOps that the U.S. Navy has developed over the last 50 plus years of how to operate in the most stealthy manner for our submarines of speed and depth and all these things. So it's how you operate too that also contributes to that. So it's the combination of, I say, these three major things that will, and the continuing to evaluate threats as they develop and adapt both with new equipment or new techniques, I think will help ensure that I think SSBNs and the Columbia will be, remain the most survivable and, undetectable of any submarine out there going forward with this. On the number piece, right, people have talked about, the last several years, okay, can we get away with 10? Can we with 8 or even 6 has been mentioned. In that regard, and I will say with this, right, even if you cut to 10, right now the policy is 10 operational SSBNs to ensure you have the sufficient number of SSBNs continually at sea. As Brian, the Admiral talked about, right, it's important to have those submarines at sea so they're in a mode already non-detectable. You don't give the adversary an opportunity to detect one or two coming out of port and try to, track them that way. If they're always at sea, it makes it infinitely harder from that perspective. So as you see, later in the life, the Columbias won't get refueled, but there is modernization things that come up. So at 10, you're not going to always have 10. That's not going to be the case. And as you lower down to 6 or 8, right now you're taking even more risk going forward there of how many can you have at sea. And again, allowing your adversaries to focus more efforts on detecting and finding the ones you do have in that regard. And as Brian said too, right, the smaller the fleet, right, the greater percentage of your survivable warheads is on each submarine. So as with 12, it's like 5 to 10% as James said, but as you go further and further, smaller and smaller, 6, right, it's double that, right? So again, it changes the calculus for the adversary. Am I more likely trying to go over that or not? So it affects our deterrence of others' adversaries in that regard. Another thing too is, again, the threat environment has drastically changed. It's not the Cold War. We're not just pretty much focused all our efforts on the Soviet Union, now Russia. Russia and China are becoming increasingly belligerent, doing actions trying to weaken the alliance of U.S. and other regional alliances out there. If they perceive a weakness in our strategic deterrent and our umbrella for our adversaries, right, they can use that to further weaken those alliances. And if our partners who fall under our nuclear umbrella of extended deterrence, if they don't have faith in that umbrella is going to cover them, then they're going to be more likely to develop their own nuclear weapons, and you get increased proliferation and essentially, in a way, right, a less safe world in that perspective. So it's important to have that piece with that too. And a smaller fleet too is, right, with, again, now these multiple targets, right? It's not just Russia and China, right? We're North Korea, Iran, potentially other nations trying to deter with our nuclear forces. And I have less out there, right? Big areas, depending where I need to be to address these targets, then I may have to travel faster than I would if I have submarines already out there. So I could change my operating profile potentially of these submarines out there, making them in a more vulnerable, with speed and things that I could do. So I have less. I could have to be forced to operate them in a less stealthy mode, which again then increases the risk to those submarines. Other people have said, well, I can go with less submarines too. I can just load more warheads on my Trident missiles and still have the same number of targets. But again, that provides the president and strategic planners less options of, adjusting and uploading to new threats or multiple threats you're trying to deter at one time, right? We're not just focused on one nation and deterrence from that perspective too. So these all play into multiple things, I think, are additional consequences you need to think about when you're adjusting the number of SSBNs. Because I'd say even a perceived weakness, it may not be a true weakness that we assess, but if our adversaries perceive there's a weakness in our strategic nuclear forces, all right, and it reduces their credibility, right? Deterrent has to be credible and effective in our willingness to use it. Then again, it's less likely to deter them from taking actions going forward in this way. So that's I wanted to touch on some of the key things that they had said, addressing some of those. I will say the other important thing to kind of like give up my mic here is the budget issues with Columbia and nuclear modernization is critical, and the pressure on the Navy's shipbuilding budget by the Columbia-class is going to be significant in there. Although Congress has provided the National Sea-Based Deterrence Fund, right, which has provided the Navy some very vital acquisition authorities that allowed them to do some acceleration of production and provide reduced costs through some efficiencies. I think Navy leadership has stated this, and I agree. I think, Congress, administration, Department of Defense need to find a way to provide some additional funding for the Navy outside the normal shipbuilding budget. This is not the first time. The Navy's gotten plus-ups before when we modernized. We built the 41 for Freedom and the Ohio-class. We've also have other national level means of additional funding that's out there, for example, strategic sea lift and ballistic missile defense. So the case is out there, and I think that conversation needs to continue. Or even if we build 12 Columbias, there's some other additional effects on the Navy that would be very significant.
Thank you very much, Tom. Great presentations, and we're going to go to the audience here in a moment and get your questions. Just to get things going, Admiral, I read in the media months ago now about difficulties with welds in missile tubes, and I was wondering if you could just give us an update on how the program stands and whether that's going to represent a delay for the program in general.
Yeah, so as you know, Columbia production actually starts in 2021. To de-risk the program, we actually picked the key lines of effort that we thought were at the highest risk, and we started those very early. And one of those things we looked at was the common missile compartment, which is the tubes we're going to use on Columbia, and we started that early. So we still have lots of margin. What we had was as we ramped up in terms of missile tube production, there were some welding issues as reported in the paper. We've figured out the root causes of that. We've applied the corrective action, and we're moving forward. We still have margin in terms of when we deliver Columbia. We still expect Columbia to be delivered on time.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay, so we're going to go to you all for questions. I would ask you to wait for one of our folks to deliver you a microphone so that our online audience can hear your question as well. And then if you don't mind, please identify yourself and give us a quick synopsis of your question, if you don't mind. And I think the gentleman right here, please, was first.
Oh, thank you. Well, my name is Robert Zabsochny. I am not with any organization. I'm just here as a visitor in D.C. My question deals with there's a brief point where the attack submarines, you talk about how they'll be pretty below the 66 that's needed, and that'll make it difficult to deploy the nuclear submarines as we replace the Los Angeles class finally with all of the Virginia. I'm curious, in the case of when we talk about all the eggs in one basket in terms of inability to deploy these incredible these Columbia-class, what's going to happen if, my understanding is that they're based out only in two places, in Georgia and Washington State. Wouldn't it be better to have maybe one or two other docking ports to make sure that it's more survivable?
That's a great question. Okay, who'd like to take a swing at that one?
So I'll take that one on. So one, I know Brian mentioned that we haven't been thinking about pro-SSBN operations in a while. I will say you're not right. I won't call you wrong, but that's what I have a team that does SSBN security, and we think about pro-SSBN operations all the time. Before I came here to be the director of undersea warfare, I was the commander of Submarine Group 9 out in Bangor, and I routinely had discussions on how I would generate my force if I needed to generate my force. And part of that was teaming up with the rest of the joint force. So if I needed Coast Guard to do something for me, I would get the Coast Guard involved. If I needed to get the Air Force involved, if I needed to get our P3s or P8s involved, I would get those guys. They're co-located right there at Whidbey Island. As you know, we are developing various classes of unmanned undersea vehicles. So we're working with UUV-RON-1 in Keyport, Washington, to talk about the CONOPS for how we would use unmanned vehicles to provide that protection. And then you have the host of fixed, deployable, and mobile ASW systems that we don't talk about a lot, but are in our inventory to take advantage of. So we do talk about that. I will say there's great synergy with having all our SSBNs located in those two bases from a man, train, and equip standpoint. I understand the security vulnerability of having just two bases. But what we do have the ability to do is to do continuity of operations type stuff. So we will periodically pull our SSBNs into Guam or Pearl Harbor, or we leverage our very close relationship with the UK to pull our SSBNs into Faslane. And so we have plenty of options. So if we were to escalate, there are options we have available to make sure that we can continue to generate our ballistic missile force.
Front.
Hi, Ron O'Rourke from the Congressional Research Service. First of all, I thought that was a very good set of opening remarks from all the speakers, so I think you got the event off to a great start. I wanted to return to the issue of technical risk that you brought up in your own comments, and note that the overall schedule for building the boat doesn't have a lot of slack in it right now. So the first question of the two that I wanted to ask would be to have the Admiral, and maybe Brian also, and Tom, if they wanted to comment as well, to comment on the Navy's efforts to work to build more resiliency inside the existing schedule for the program to absorb any more unforeseen shocks that may occur between now and the 2031 scheduled date for the first deployment. And the second question, also for the Admiral, but Brian or Tom may also want to chip in on this. No offense, James, but they're programmatic questions. Would be to talk a little bit about the block buy strategy that the Navy is envisaging using as their contracting strategy for the program, and if you could do something to characterize the savings that the Navy anticipates achieving through the use of block buy contracting as a way of helping to hold down the cost of the program.
So Ron, thanks for the two questions. I will say, if you read the CNO's latest document, the Design 2.0, he has particularly challenged us to, quote unquote, deliver Columbia as soon as possible. So we've been working with the program manager, Captain Rucker, and his team, as well as PEO subs, to work with the shipbuilders to see what we can do to again, build more, what I would call margin into the schedule. Right now we're focused at getting the industrial base, the vendor base, as healthy as possible, because that's where you get the stumbles as you try to ramp up. Our nuclear industrial base has kind of been stagnant for a while. Building one Virginia, we've ramped up to two. There have been a couple manufacturing issues associated with that, but we're going to start introducing Virginia payload module, and then we're going to introduce Columbia. So we see the industrial base ramping up pretty quickly here. And so right now our focus is on making sure the industrial base can support that ramp up. And then we're also working with both HI, Newport News, and Electric Boat to see what we can do, what's in the realm of the possible to accelerate those schedules. And you've seen in the shipbuilding plan, there are gap years associated with Columbia. And if we can pull work into those gap years with the appropriate resources, we'll do that. And then similar to Virginia, using the block buys, we will use that same contracting type strategy to make sure we give the taxpayers the best bang for the buck, quite frankly.
And I agree. I think that the Navy's done a really good job of trying to use advanced procurement to try to get some of the industrial base revved up to support the supplying of the materials that are needed for the submarines down the road. The block buy will work really well to help that as well, as long as it's a real block buy, like a multi-year procurement, where you're actually contracting for multiple submarines at once. And you may pay for them on installments, like you do for your house, but you're making a contract to buy them all so that the shipbuilder and the suppliers can go get contracted to go initiate the construction or building of materials, as opposed to the block buy like we used for the littoral combat ship, where we called it a block buy, but in fact we're only buying submarine, or in that case surface ships, on a year-by-year basis, which didn't allow for any economic order of quantity to be initiated by the shipbuilder or the suppliers.
So, yeah, just to touch on, I think the Navy, has done is a good job as much as they can of, obviously the common missile compartment was one thing, right? Let's try to work and build those, work some of those bugs out and find those technical risks early. The work they've been doing with the electric drive motor up in Philadelphia, with that perspective, I think of trying to, where they can, buying down the risk of these areas. On the block buy, I'm fully supportive of that, like exactly, but in the mode that Brian said, because, I think if you have a whiplash of any doubt of, okay, contract the next sub and things like that, I think it's not just, the electric boats and some of those, right? They can absorb some of that, but you don't want to impact their, their workforce as they're trying to ramp up and train and hire new people. But I think most importantly, it's some of those small vendors that provide very critical services and parts, having them have the the fiscal certainty that they know, okay, I've got at least, whether it's 5 or whatever, that are going to happen, as they ramp up their own infrastructure and workforce, I think is very critical to ensure that we have savings and that everything goes as smoothly as possible.
Thanks, guys. Yes, sir, Admiral, or not Admiral, I'm sorry, Ambassador. There we go, there's your microphone.
Oh, yeah. I'm so excited about the Columbia. I think it's maybe the final shield of America. And in a very, very dangerous world we're moving into in the next 10 years, 12 years, when we may see the apogee of the China-Russia great powers threat probably by the end of 2030. And at which point, there are those that say the Chinese Navy will be twice the size of ours. I'm not sure that it will be twice as capable as ours, but we certainly have to look at that as a real threat to our very survival if indeed anything goes wrong in potential conflict. I have a little bit of history that I'd like to ask a question about and see how we would react this time. Mr. Carter asked me to stay on as secretary, and I was going to a little bit, but Harold Brown and Mr. Carter informed me that they were going to cut my new shipbuilding program of 156 ships and a half to reprioritize to other more valuable programs at the moment, which there was a lot of welfare programs and others that Mr. Carter had in mind. I actually resigned because I didn't see the point of weakening ourselves in the face of the approaching apogee of the Cold War with the Soviets, which we predicted would be in the late 80s. And it was true. We came on strong with the Trident and Aegis and a lot of other weapon systems, and we outspent the Soviets, and they collapsed. Economically, they collapsed. It's not entirely true, but there is some truth to the fact that the Soviet Union at that time, and perhaps even today, Russia today, is really just a gas station with nukes. But they've got a few other things going. But basically, a lot of it depends on their gas and oil. So if indeed we put the nation at great risk when we canceled the Navy's shipbuilding program, or half of it, in 1977, and then when recently, 6 to 8 years ago, we canceled the ASAT program, and a lot of advanced programs that were to protect us in space, and a lot of R&D went by the board to protect us against the approaching apogee of Soviet China great powers capabilities threat, looking out 5 to 10 years, perhaps 10 years. Are we putting ourselves at risk again when recently, 2 months ago, one of the key senators said when we take control in 2020, we're going to cut substantially this military-industrial complex, waste of money. I'm sorry, Mr. Obama is probably calling up protesting my recent statement. But comes now the cutting out these advanced programs again is a risk I see. The actual quote was from the senator, well, Russia's only spending $75 billion on defense. We're spending 750 or thereabouts. Why are they a threat? Well, there are a lot of reasons why they're a threat. They, combined with China, it amounts to a great deal more than that. When you add in the cost-benefit ratio, if you look at our tooth-to-tail ratios, approaching, I guess, 50%, Admiral, something like that, compared to perhaps a much lower percentage for Russia and China. They're getting more for the buck, so to speak. I think the vice chief of the deputy of the, I've forgotten Admiral Whelan's role, and he said recently that if you add up the cost-benefit ratios of the China and Russia and tooth to tail and all the other factors, their budgets are really probably 350 billion or something approaching substantially more than the acknowledged figures if you add in the cost-benefit ratio. Now, the senator is not looking at that. He's talking about redirecting our priorities away from defense or advanced weapon systems in defense, and perhaps one can even read the word Columbia in that, and into other areas following the Carter and most recent administration actions, if that's a guide for the future. I say this because I lived through, it was a terrible beating for me to lose that and saw our nation be put at risk. Fortunately, Mr. Reagan came in and reversed it very quickly, and we went back on that program very quickly, and we moved very fast, and we were able to win the Cold War, as you know. I personally think that we should not be talking about 6 Columbias. We should talk about the maximum. If it is the final shield in America, we should be talking about as a national priority over everything else, that and R&D into new weapon systems technology and AI and space, cyber, robots, laser, EMP, all those things should be national emergencies right now, but especially, and if the Columbia is the final shield of America, we should double the number and have the number at 12, and because the only way to preserve, to not have a war, is to preserve peace through strength. That's a question, and could I ask the panel if they would agree that we should prioritize that?
Yeah, it's a great question, sir. Thank you. And so I think I'm going to give the Admiral a pass on this because it ventures into the political world, unless you really want to take a swing at it, and maybe we'll.
So what I'll offer is that the 30-year shipbuilding plan, the plan of record shows that we will continue serial production of a Columbia-sized vessel past number 12, and that gives leadership the option that if they want more Columbias, they will have that option, and if they don't, we can go the conventional route and do what we're coining a large volume host platform.
Yep, good. Brian, anything to add?
I think the biggest concern I would have with reducing the defense budget and reducing some of these construction programs is the fact that it starts to undermine the seed corn for the future as we lose a lot of the R&D base and we lose the shipbuilding base. I mean, when we cut the shipbuilding budget the degree we did in the 70s, a lot of shipyards went out of business, and now you can't reconstitute those. So maintaining the ability to construct ships in the future kind of requires us to construct them, at least in the near term.
James, anything?
I'd just say ultra briefly that, the strategy is connecting means to ends, right? That's what strategy is. So starting with a clear-eyed perception of what national resources are available is the starting point of strategy. And if Columbia is a critical program and, in favor of 12 boats, one has to think about what the trade-offs are going to be. And deciding that you're going to identify those trade-offs earlier rather than later, for me, is the essence of strategic thinking and long-term planning and budgeting.
Yes, I mean, just to build on some of what Brian the Admiral said, one from the shipbuilding perspective, right? I think, Admiral Merz and his team did a great job of identifying through shipbuilding, what is the kind of the minimum shipbuilding needed to sustain, the current shipbuilding industrial base we have right now, which is drastically smaller than it was during the Reagan administration, even in the 90s, and it's very fragile. As Ken Perry is here from the Electric Boat can say, right, is that, you have to get rid of these workers. It takes years to bring them back and train. It is important to consider that. And on the R&D side, not just on submarine R&D, but I think other important emerging technologies, hypersonics, railgun lasers, these are things that we're seeing, right, our adversaries, the China, the Russias, others are investing heavily in. And they may or may not be have ones that are ready to deploy or out there, how mature they are. But whether we invest in these technologies to defend ourselves and our allies, our adversaries are, and we can't just hope that they mature on their own and we get to deploy them in several years. It's identifying and putting aside money for R&D, I think, over the next 10 to 20 years is critical to mature these technologies that we believe show real capability and promise, and continue to feed those. Too often we stop funding, we lose patience, and then several years later we say, oh no, these are important, and we start having to start from scratch, and we've wasted billions of dollars. I think it's important to identify the critical ones and give them stable funding to mature them over time.
Hey, before I want to get one thing in and then see where we go with that, and that is we've talked about 12 boats, and I think we got from 12 to 10, and we said 2 are going to be in deep maintenance. I'm still okay. Okay, and then we've said U.S. Strategic Command has said their requirement's 10, and I've always been a skeptic, and so would anyone want to take a crack at why U.S. Strategic Command needs 10? And I know we could get into some classified stuff here, but I'd love to have somebody kind of say, here is the shorthand, the whiteboard kind of quick, why 10? Why can't we have 8 and everybody gets a 6-hour energy drink or something like that? Why can't we go a little bit lower? Anybody want to take a swing at that?
Yes, okay, Brian.
So I'll do it so John doesn't have to do it. If you think of the submarine having a normal deployment of maybe 70 days, and then it's in port for maybe 30 days afterwards, and that's just rough math. So it means it's got about a 70% availability. So if you do the math on a fleet of 10 ships that are operationally available, and you run the 70% against it, well, that means you got about 7 submarines that can be operating at any one time. And if you've got one that's alert in the Pacific and one that's alert in the Atlantic, then you've got some spares. And like we talked about, you're going to need those spares because you can't have just one submarine in each ocean being the sea-based strategic deterrent, because otherwise it would incentivize the other guys to go after it, because it's a way to eliminate in one fell swoop all of that that coast's nuclear strategic deterrent. So if you've got some spares out there and you got 2 or 3 spares, maybe on each coast, now you end up into that requires you to have 7 operational submarines out of that fleet of 10, and the other 3 are in the course of their turnovers between crews. So it's a pretty aggressive schedule in terms of the ship's availability. 70% of the time being at sea is a pretty aggressive operational availability. But that's how you get to the need to maintain that redundancy so that you reduce the vulnerability of your SSBN force.
Thanks. Okay, back to the audience. Yes, sir, on the end there, please.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dan Leone. I'm a reporter with Defense Daily. Admiral, forgive the descent back into the dirt here, but could you tell us what the root cause of those bad welds was and how much margin they've got left in that program? In other words, what went wrong and what's their absolute drop dead to fix it and deliver?
Yes, I would just offer that, as the workload increased, they outsourced some of the work, some of the non-destructive testing wasn't done correctly, and as a result, the workers didn't get good welds. And at the end of the day, when we adjudicate all the issues, we still have many months of margin left in Columbia.
Good, thank you. Okay, yes, sir, with the red tie.
Thank you, John Harper with National Defense Magazine. My question is for Admiral Taemin. As the Navy conducts a new force structure assessment, do you anticipate that requirement for 12 Columbia-class subs will remain the same, or do you think there's a possibility it might go even higher? And then just looking at your portfolio more broadly, and as the Navy works toward a 355-ship fleet, do you anticipate that the service might change its ship counting rules to allow for unmanned systems to count towards the total ship count?
That's a bad question, apparently.
Right. Not allowed.
So I would offer that it would be inappropriate to comment on the current force structure assessment, but I think that the security environment hasn't changed regarding SSBN since the nuclear posture review, so I think 12 is still a good number for now. And then in terms of unmanned vehicles, and how that affects the force structure assessment, that's still to be determined. Right now, we have at sea small and medium unmanned undersea vehicles. We've yet to truly introduce large or extra large at scale in the undersea domain. So I think once we have appropriate runtime with those vehicles, then we'll start those discussions.
Good, okay. Other questions? I've got one for you, James. I was hoping you might outline with a little more detail your ideas on where we should go with NC3. You kind of alluded to it.
Sure. So my
Nuclear command, control, and something else.
I mean, there's lots of different acronyms, all of which kind of point to the same thing. But the concern that I have in particular is almost every nuclear command and control asset that's been publicly acknowledged, I'm sure there's lots that haven't been, but everyone that's been acknowledged is dual use. That is, it's used for both nuclear and non-nuclear operations. Advanced extremely high frequency satellites are used for communications for nuclear forces and non-nuclear communications. Ssbn's early warning satellites are used for detecting an incoming nuclear attack and detecting, for example, non-nuclear ballistic missiles for the purpose of triggering ballistic missile defenses. What all of this means is that in a large-scale conventional conflict, adversaries might have an incentive to start attacking nuclear command and control assets, perhaps to undermine their conventional functions, for the purpose of winning or not losing the conventional war. But those attacks would have the effect, incidentally, of degrading the US nuclear command and control architecture. And, we've built our nuclear command and control architecture around quite reasonably surviving and fighting a nuclear war, right? We do things like we harden satellites to protect them against electromagnetic pulses in a nuclear war. But that's really expensive, and so we've ended up with a relatively few of these things. And that's kind of not the design you want if you're worried about them being attacked with conventional weapons before the nuclear war even starts. So, for me, this problem that our nuclear command and control architecture could become vulnerable in a conventional war really demands a quite root and branch rethink of nuclear command and control. In the case of SSBNs, I've mentioned the satellites and their vulnerability. There's a backup system, the low frequency and very low frequency transmitters. I can find those on Google Earth. They're really big and you can't move them. and I'm pretty sure Russia and China know where they are. And that really just leaves the airborne leg as like the ultimate backup. And, I think there is much more that we can and should be thinking about to enhance that. One example, one idea off the top of my head, well, not quite off the top of my head, but, things like unmanned UAVs, unmanned airborne vehicles. One could imagine having very large numbers of those deployed over a very large area in a crisis. As a way of providing a kind of emergency backup communication systems in case large parts of the force got attacked. In the case of space, rather than having very large dedicated satellites, putting communication transponders on large numbers of other satellites. We actually did something like this in the Cold War called AFSATCOM. My point is not here necessarily to advocate for any one particular solution. People with access to the classified are going to have to weigh up the pros and cons of everything. I can't do that. But it's really to say two things. That firstly, I think we need to worry about conventional attack before a nuclear war starts. And secondly, we shouldn't just build our existing command and control architecture a bit better because it's basically what we've been doing and the easiest thing is just to replace it. I think that before we start on this much needed recapitalization project, we should be prepared to consider a much wider range of alternatives that may look quite different to the kind of architectures we have at the moment.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, any final questions from anyone in the audience? If not, I would ask you to join me in thanking our panel. I think, unless I'm mistaken, there's sandwiches this way. Normally they're that way, and this time they're this way, and I think in this case there's submarine sandwiches. So have a great rest of your day. Thank you.